Very much, Moz, and thanks, Craig, as well, for your time. So I'm sorry about that, but I think everyone will agree that it was very worthwhile to have that little bit of extra time to hear from all of our panelists. And thank you again for sharing your time and your experiences. I'll start off with Apryl. Apryl, as you said, and I think I mistakenly said it was 40 years, but 30 years since the Royal Commission to Aboriginal Deaths in Custody. That Royal Commission really gave us a roadmap and recommendations about how to stop or prevent Aboriginal deaths in custody. But as you said, since that time, we've had almost 500 people pass away in custody. And you've tragically had that first-hand experience with the system and with how the system deals with individuals and families who have been affected by a death in custody. What do you think are the biggest roadblocks in the way for governments to implement the recommendations of the Royal Commission?
I think it's the fact that they choose to ignore the systemic racism within the institutions. For example, within Mum's case, Victoria Police played a huge part in her death, and things like the coronial system isn't actually supportive of seeking the right justice and accountability that families require. We had seen during Mum's coronial inquest that there's not a lot of truth telling. There is no truth telling in coronial inquests. There's a lot of deflecting and there's a lot of I do not recall. But from the interactions that they had with Mum, where they had arrested her for public drunkenness, and she was removed off that train within 60 seconds of the interaction with the train conductor. They have arrested her and they have put her in a police cell, didn't monitor her effectively, and she's fallen multiple times. And one of those falls caused a traumatic brain bleed, causing her to die. But immediately after they had taken her to that police station, they had actually picked up a white woman that was arrested for public drunkenness as well. But the difference was she wasn't asleep. She was actually verbally abusive to everyone that was at the Cumberland Hotel. And instead, they had picked her up and they had taken her home safely, and they didn't even actually give her a fine. So they had chose a community police approach where with Mum, she was racially profiled and she was put in a police cell for her own safety, but they didn't actually monitor her effectively. So during that coronial inquest, the coroner had actually failed to find racism and the way that they interacted with Mum. And we see that a lot of the time during coronial inquests is that they don't actually pinpoint the racism within that's caused our loved ones' deaths. And they don't even highlight how inadequate the investigations are and the complete police bias when they have a police officer investigating their own. Because you have a coroner and then underneath that you have the police investigator. So if you are highlighting their failures, you're also highlighting your own failures. And I feel like that's similar to the governments not able to recognise the failures that are continuing to happen because of them not implementing the recommendations. And there's a lot of blame between the state and federal, where if they had actually implemented the recommendations 30 years ago, the majority of deaths that have been caused wouldn't have actually happened, Mum's being one of those. Like there are multiple deaths that are linked directly to the recommendations. And it's a continuous struggle for families to get that acknowledgement and to get them to get the truth out of the coronial inquest. But then to actually have someone prosecuted and convicted for that is next to impossible because the systems aren't established and set up to get the justice for Aboriginal people. You know, like the police, since invasion, has been perpetrating that colonial violence. So it has been an ongoing struggle. And until the governments are willing to actually hold institutions like police, prisons, even the health sector to account, deaths will continue if they aren't going to hold those people accountable and if they're not going to implement those recommendations.
Thanks so much, Apryl. What can we do to help people who have been affected by deaths in custody? What can we as individuals or as a community do to be an ally and to help those who've been affected by tragedies?
I think, speaking just from experience, as what I found had really helped us was the community approach, in a sense of that wraparound love and support. It may not seem like a big deal to some of just attending the coronial inquest, but it is actually huge. For us as a family to see people that now we've actually formed really strong lifelong friendships with, just solely because they were supporting us during our most difficult time, is, you know, something that's really special. And it's important for the media and for the police and for the other people that are responsible for these deaths to see that there is that public support, because it does keep the pressure on. And sharing the stories on social media is really important, because, like I said earlier, mainstream media don't actually report on our deaths, and they don't report on them correctly, and they victim blame. A lot of the deaths haven't actually been shared. There may be one article and then it gets left. People don't even know what's actually happening. They don't know when the coronial is going to happen. So actually physically being there and showing up, signing petitions, donating to their family campaigns and GoFundMes so they can continue to campaign and go to the coronial inquest. And also people that have actually got skills to donate their time for that, whether it's like, you know, if they've got campaigning skills, if it's graphic design, like every little part makes a difference when you're trying to campaign for something that is extremely difficult, like an abolition of the law that's extremely overdue. But like I said too, just sharing the stories, speaking about it in your own homes, and having that conversation with people so we don't have to. Like, we shouldn't have to be doing the labour all the time trying to explain why our lives matter and why we shouldn't be dying at the hands of police every week. It's really important that allies share that burden with us. So, like, we don't need to be constantly displaying our trauma to be able to, you know, make it sound like we should be treated with basic human rights within our own country.
Thanks so much, Apryl. They're really important and inspiring words, and I hope that everyone who's present tonight takes you up on those things as well, and helps out in whatever little way they can. Mohamed, I'll just turn to you briefly. You started Endeavour Youth Australia to train future leaders, and you've been very active in the human rights space, including last year during the hard lockdown of the Flemington and North Melbourne towers, where you helped residents. For someone of your age and your generation, what are some of the biggest human rights issues do you think that there are, and what can we do to help advocate for those issues?
I would have to say, for someone my position, I'm speaking from lived experience and through the I guess like lens of like the area I live in and what I've seen and like the things I've been exposed to. I would say racism and discrimination. And I'd like to reiterate what Apryl was saying on systemic institutionalized racism. And I feel like it's important that we understand that it's a systemic issue, and systemic issues need a systemic solution, right? It needs to attack the institution. I feel like one thing that Apryl taught me, right? It gave me, I guess, a formula, I would say, to my activism, right? So when we were denied entry to the Apple store, it was clearly because of the color of our skin. We recorded it, posted it, we went worldwide, and we ended up getting an apology from Tim Cook, the CEO, but also what he did afterwards is what really surprised me. So he ordered all the staff around the world to be retrained in customer inclusion and diversity. So that's when I realized that it's easy, right, to go and I guess like be in the school and speak to teachers, but there's 100 schools in Victoria, right? And you can't reach everybody. But I feel like once you tackle the institution and you put things in place for that generational change and like that rippling effect, I guess that's when it's the most effective. So one thing that we're trying to do with Endeavour Youth Australia is, I guess, try and build that environment where discussions can be had. And it's not easy to speak about racism. People get defensive, but addressing it is the important thing. When I was growing up, it was very hard to speak about racism. Every time I brought it up, I was the one that was getting punished. I was the one that's getting sent to the office, or, you know, Mohammed, you don't know what you're talking about. Or so the most important thing is that we have that discussion, we talk about it, acknowledge it, and then try and put things in place. So through Endeavour Youth Australia, we're trying to change the narrative. And that's why when I look at young people from the community, especially what was happening in North Melbourne and Flemington, right? The amount of initiative that was shown for young people inspired me, right? And it was one of the main factors in me running for council last year, because I saw the negligence and the lack of cultural awareness from leaders that were meant to, I guess, take us out of like the pandemic, lead us. And one thing that I saw in North Melbourne and Flemington is that lack of like cultural awareness. I was the one, my friends and my community were the ones that were calling people inside the towers, asking them what they wanted, facilitating most of that at the beginning. So what that showed me was, okay, the only way that we're going to have that actual change is if we're reflected in positions of power. You know, I guess it's very important that leaders are a reflection of the community they're serving. And right now, that doesn't seem to be the case, but that's why we're trying to identify in these young leaders, because there are young people right now that just don't have the opportunity. For instance, when I was younger, a lot of the opportunity wasn't shown to me. I'll give you an example. Whenever there was an opportunity to take up a position at the school or outside of school, or organization wanted to come and like give people, I guess, opportunities, it was perceived that I didn't want to succeed. Oh, we're not going to share Mohammed because he might not even want to do it. Like, that's why that decision shouldn't be made for me. It should be placed in front of me, and then, okay, I should be able to decide whether I want to take it on board or not. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to offer as much support and opportunity to young people, and that's give them the support they need to succeed. And that's when we start establishing those that diversity in leadership, and that's when we can start seeing the Australia we all want to see. Yeah, that's what I have to say.
Thanks. Thank you, Mohammed. I'll just quickly ask Moz and Craig, this is really building upon what both of you said in your speeches, but I guess there's two questions. One is, what can we do practically to help individuals or to help groups of people who are currently suffering under the policies? And what can we do more generally to really, well, try to change the current harsh policies that are in place?
Thank you very much, Julia. It's a very important question. It's, I think, less than 1 year to the election, and both parties are using the innocent people in the detention for their votes. Some people, some politicians in Labour Party decides not to say anything at the moment, and Liberal Party is continuing and blaming Labour Party that they are taking them to Papua New Guinea, and they created an offshore detention center. What we can do is to, when the politicians, when the parties don't listen to us, people in the society have to create a system, have to create a campaign all together. If we create, there could be like 10 or 20 campaigns in the sector, but we need to follow and support the highest, the top campaign, and all the sector get united together. When we are together, I am sure not only the Labour Party is speaking, I am sure the Liberal Party will quickly release the refugees in the detention, because when enough people hear the stories of what happened to these innocent people for 8 years, then a wave of change happens. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Moz. So look, Moz, as usual, really said it all there. I think, look, there are 34, 35 people currently locked up in the Park Hotel in Swanston Street, Carlton in Melbourne. And there are, I would imagine, quite a high number of refugee support organisations right across Melbourne. And I have been many times to those protests, and those protests should be 10 times as large. And every organisation should be there. Every person should be making clear to all of their close supporters, friends, family and otherwise that this is ongoing. And it cannot be acceptable that people have been detained for 8 years. They're in a hotel right next to the city in Melbourne, and you know there's a handful of people out the front protesting. I just find that staggering. Okay, anyone who's in the refugee sector has to be there, firstly, and that whole scenario has to be brought to its knees. The only way to do it is either through a public pressure or through the political system. When it comes to the forthcoming election, then more Australians, and there's already enough to mobilise a very significant amount of people, need to make very clear that we all feel that any politician's position when it comes to the ongoing and indefinite detention of innocent refugees is a factor for us in our selection of you. Doesn't matter what your party is. It is a factor for us in our selection of you as part of, as a public representative of our local area. So this issue has to go to the very heart of the nature of Australia and actually, stop being so politicised. In other words, become a human rights issue. And more Australians simply need to say, I'm not voting unless you're going to step forward and add your voice to bring this to an end. So I think the entire sector should be saying to every person who wants to run for public office in the next election, do you or do you not support the ongoing detention of refugees on Australian shore and offshore who've been there for 8 years? And people have to be called out. Everyone has to be. It's the only way that this can be brought to an end. And there is, I'll say again, there are more than enough people who have been supportive of refugees over a very long period of time, who, if brought together en masse at a time when this has gone beyond any dimensions or definitions of inhumanity, to bring this to an end. The only question is, can it happen?
Thank you, Craig. And someone's just put through that the protests are daily outside the Park Hotel in Naarm in Melbourne, 5:30 to 6:30 on weekdays and 3 to 4 p.m. on weekends. One question that's been asked that really is for all the panellists, that in the stories that have been shared tonight, racism and systemic racism is really a common thread that goes through all of the stories, and really meeting and relating to each other as a human being, it would hopefully be one of the most powerful ways of addressing that systemic racism. What do you, and this is really to everyone, the panelists, what do you encourage those listening tonight to do to help address those systemic issues? Apryl, I might start with you.
I guess firstly, educate yourself as to what's actually happening around you. For example, what happened to Mum, until we had actually spoken about it, no one knew what had happened. And that's not necessarily at the individual's fault. That's happening at whatever state or, town that it's at. But when you are seeing people rally and you are seeing things like petitions and people lobbying, it's for a good reason, and we do need support around that. But if you are staying within your own little bubble because you're not actually affected by racism, then that's just leaving us to have to fight and deal with it on our own. So I think that the best way, one of the ways and starting way, is actually educating yourself and seeing within your own capacity what you can do to help those people that are affected by it. I know, like, it is for like with mum and like deaths in custody in general, it's very traumatic, and it can be very difficult whether you've experienced it yourself or not, and it can take a lot to be able to support a family that's going through that. So if you are trying to look after your mental health and that's not something that you can do, like I said, sharing the stories and showing up, writing to your public council and your politicians, and, you know, like we've been calling out for the Prime Minister to meet with the families that have experienced a death in custody to talk about the demands that we put forward. And, you know, for example, some of them are things like implementing the recommendations. So just doing whatever you can within your own capacity to address those things. And I think educating yourself is the best start at doing that.
Thanks very much, Apryl. Mohamed, did you have any thoughts in respect to that? You're on mute now.
I was on mute here. I would have to agree with Apryl. I think the most important thing is allyship. As a young African, there's not a lot I can do on my own, right? I'm not in control of any institutions. I don't have like any power per se. All I have is my voice and my stories. And if that's amplified by allies in positions of power, like this, like Libre Victoria right now, giving me the platform to, I guess, speak on my lived experience, trying to, I guess, create that cultural awareness, then I guess that's the most important thing. Because there's a lot of things that that cultural and linguistic diverse people bring to Australian society. Refugees, I'm a refugee myself. My family was in a camp before arriving here. I was too young to remember, but like all that lived experience, all that drive, I think can be utilized to make Australia a better place. But it's all about having platforms that are, I guess, controlled by us, right? Because I feel like now a lot of the platforms and a lot of the things that I guess young people right now are using, they don't necessarily have that type of like ownership or like say over, and it's very easy to get taken away. So I guess it's about giving young people a voice, giving the multicultural nation a voice, and identifying and investing in them.
Thanks, Mohamed. And we've had people also pop into the chat the website for the Dhadjowa Foundation, as well as the fundraising for the foundation, and also for Endeavour Youth Australia. So I encourage everyone to look at those websites and to help support those excellent causes. Craig and Moz, what were your thoughts in respect of that issue?
Craig, you talk first. So, I didn't get the voice of Mohamed the last minutes. If you speak, Craig.
Yeah, so I would say that for people in my position, and that is as a white Anglo-Australian, is definitely to educate ourselves, to open our eyes, firstly, to acknowledge that, you know, colonisation, racism was at the heart of that, and that we've never dealt with it, to have enough courage to listen without responding emotionally, and learn, read, and, you know, there's plenty of work out there. You know, there's films and there's books, whatever it is that you like. There's a tremendous amount of material. You know, we've had the Black Lives Matter movement recently in America, and I do think it's been profoundly important because it has coined phrases like silence is violence. And it's for the first time, I think, really got through to the psyche of non-people of colour, if you like, that we are responsible for the system that we've helped build and that we rely on for what we have, you know, for whatever it is that we do in life, and the privilege that we have, the privilege to walk down the street and not be racially profiled like Mohamed, the privilege I have to, you know, not incredibly sadly, you know, have family members put into the situation that Apryl has had, and to recognise that that is, you know, entirely about race. If we're talking about refugees here and Mostafa and Mohamed, we have to recognise that if it was, you know, people fleeing, white people from South Africa, then they wouldn't be interned for 8 years on Manus Island or Nauru or elsewhere, as you know, the former Home Affairs Minister made very clear in recent years. If people were fleeing from Britain, you know, who were white, if people who are fleeing who weren't Muslim, or they're not Sudanese, or they're not of colour, they would not be locked up over this period of time. It's just a simple fact. And as a country, we need to wrestle with that. We need to deal with it and get to the very heart. I might just finally finish by saying that the only way we can do that is go back to move forward. And that is go back to colonisation, get to the truth of what occurred. And it's so wonderful that that's starting to come out. You know, reconcile ourselves. First Nations have nothing to reconcile, but we have to reconcile with the history of our own country. Look at what I believe the Uluru Statement is, the expression of the right of Indigenous Australia to self-determination under the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples globally. For them to, for you know, First Nations people to have absolute centrality in decision-making regarding their own culture, their people, and political decisions made in their regard. And I cannot for the life of me see why that seems to be such a difficult discussion in Australia. It's long overdue, and it certainly, we have to say, is time.
Thank you, Craig. I just, one thing I want to add is when I arrived to Australia, Aboriginal people came and welcomed me to this land. Lydia Thorpe and her family and some other Aboriginal people came and welcomed me, and I felt they were like my family. Actually, they are. And also, if we link all these groups together, all the nations together, we become one, like a family. Then we understand our pain. Then we understand the meaning of torture correctly. If someone is in detention, you know, it doesn't make sense when we are, you know, this country is imprisoning children in detention. Like if look at the 65% of Aboriginal children, like the people who are, like the children go to detention, 65% of them are Aboriginal, and they want to show the other parts of society, look, this is Aboriginal people, they are taking this. But that is completely wrong. It's because they are a part of this kind of, this government is creating fear to the nation that they want to show that Aboriginal people are stealing things, they are bad. But the truth is that they are driving fear to the nation, and definitely there is no crime, definitely they are innocent, and they just send fear to the nation. If anyone don't respect to the Aboriginal people, they were criminals. People who came to Australia, the white people who came to Australia were criminals. Aboriginal people let them come to this land, and they are putting their children in detention. It's horrible. I hope that a gladiator come to this land and put all the liberal members to the 5-star hotels and lock them for 8 years so that they feel how other parts of society feeling for what they did to innocent people. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Moz, and thanks, Craig, as well. We've run a little bit over time, so I'm sorry about that, but I think everyone will agree that it was very worthwhile to have that little bit of extra time to hear from all of our panelists. And thank you again for sharing your time and your experiences. There's a number of links that have gone up in the chat for different organisations and different ways, as both Craig and Apryl have said, to educate ourselves. And I encourage everyone to take up the call to what all of our panellists have said here to help make a difference, hopefully, and to help improve human rights in and around Australia.